October 13th, 1985, New York City after midnight.
A man has been murdered, thrown down the streets from his penthouse apartment. The homicide detectives inspecting the crime scene deduce that the victim, Edward Blake, fought against his assailant but was overpowered. While guessing the motivations for his murder, they comment about Blake's impressive physique and diplomatic background, where he had known the vice president. Despite acknowledging the graphic way how Blake had been murdered, the homicide detectives are mostly apathetic and more concerned about how the masked vigilantes, forced into retirement after 1977 Skin Act, could respond to it. Especially when one of them, named Rorschach, is still active and not soon later already moving to inspect the crime scene to solve Edward Blake's murder. After having taken a look into Blake's apartment, Rorschach discovers a hidden compartment inside Blake's wardrobe, hiding a costume, a mask, weapons, and a framed portrait of a young Blake with other costumed vigilantes. Elsewhere, another veteran with the same portrait, an old car mechanic named Hollis Mason, is sitting down with his also retired successor, Daniel Dryberg, enjoying their usual Saturday night beers while talking nostalgically about the good old days. When Daniel has to leave, Hollis sees him off and reminds him about how the younger man was the better Nite-Owl than him, which Daniel politely disagrees before heading for home. After a quick walk, Daniel finds his home having been broken into by Rorschach, who greets Daniel by name to establish them knowing each other. In his own eccentric way, Rorschach has come to tell Daniel about Edward Blake's murder, and how investigating his murder led to the discovery of him having been a fellow masked vigilante known as the Comedian. Daniel moves their conversation from his kitchen, where Rorschach had held himself to some beans, to his basement where Daniel's equipment are collecting dust. Rorschach and Daniel focus on talking about who and what could have caused Blake's death, especially when, as a former masked vigilante still in good shape, should have been able to overpower any random home invader. Due to Blake's diplomatic civilian job, this could have been a political murder as Daniel suggests, or maybe someone is killing off masked heroes as Rorschach suspects. That latter possibility could make Blake's former colleagues, in which Hollis Mason is included, suspects, and Daniel does not like Rorschach bringing that up. So Rorschach decides to leave, having mostly come to warn Daniel about someone possibly being after vigilantes like them. Daniel lets Rorschach leave via the tunnel exit that he used to take when they used to be partners, back before Daniel quit being Nite-Owl. 16 or so hours later, during which Rorschach has slept to gather his strength, he goes to Happy Harry's Bar and Grill to interrogate its patrons for what the word on the street is, but learns nothing about Blake's murder, even after threatening to break one's fingers after having been made fun of. Next, he decides to go visit Adrian Vade, and another former masked vigilante, Ozymandias, who has by now unmasked himself and made a fortune by selling his story and brand. Something that Rorschach needs to point out to Adrian when he compares Blake as a comedian to a Nazi, while protecting his country and never making a bigger number out of it than Vade has. Adrian, while clearly offended, takes the message while reminding Rorschach that he retired and unmasked as Ozymandias 2 years before the Keene Act, which Rorschach only finds more suspicious, but otherwise won't outstay his welcome. Similarly as with his visit to Daniel, Rorschach mostly came to warn Vade about a possible mask killer, and leaves having now done so. Later in the day, while on his way to the last 2 former masked vigilantes he knows, Rorschach lists and writes down all the others he is still aware of into his journal, most of whom are living bittersweet retirements or having passed away by now like Edward Blake has. He has now arrived to the military Rockefeller Research Center, home to those last 2 people, Dr. Manhattan and Lori Juspesic, to tell them about Edward Blake's murder, of which Dr. Manhattan has already been briefed on as he works for the government. During his visit, Rorschach also learns that Dr. Manhattan apathetically does not care about Blake's death, while Lori is bitterly happy to hear about it in knowing how Blake had in the past sexually assaulted her mother, which she learned about from Hollis Mason's book, and for which Blake never sued Mason for defamation. While Rorschach downplays Blake's assault on Lori's mother, while also mentioning that he has warned Daniel and Adrian as well, she asks Dr. Manhattan to send him away, which he then does after Rorschach does not initially leave after having been asked nicely. Having warned all of his old allies now, Rorschach walks away into the rainy night, while Lori, still indoors, tells Dr. Manhattan that she needs to go out. Dr. Manhattan is too focused on what he is working on to join her, so Lori calls Daniel to invite him for a late-night dinner at Raphael's penthouse restaurant. They meet there to talk about their glory days, of which Lori does not see as a huge achievement when looking at her life as a government-hired escort for Dr. Manhattan, after having spent 10 years of her life having lived her mother's dream as a vigilante, and the last 8 years retired from that job. Daniel mostly agrees with her passive attitude, but it is clear that they both do not feel alive in their retirements. Then they remember a former harmless villain named Captain Carnage, whom they had both come across trying to pick up a fight, and had just let go in not seeing him as a worthy effort. When Lori asks what happened to the harmless villain, Daniel tells her that he ran into Rorschach, who responded less gently to his approach, and threw him into an elevator shaft. Lori laughs uncomfortably hearing about the poor villain's fate, and comments about how rare it has been to laugh at all as of late, to which Daniel responds by pointing this possibly being because the comedian is dead. Watchmen should not need any introductions at this point in history, but since I'm working on a 12 videos long review series on it, here we go anyway. Between 1986 and 1987, writer Alan Moore, artist Dave Gibbons, and colorist John Higgins created a 12 issues long miniseries that then got published by DC Comics. It was originally supposed to star superhero characters from the Charlton comics that DC had at the time acquired for themselves, but the managing editor Dick Giordano told Moore to create original characters instead. The miniseries Watchmen is set during an alternate history set in 1985, where mass vigilantes emerge with their first wave in the 1940s and their second wave in the 1960s, corresponding with the golden and silver ages of comics. The first issue opens with a lot of world building in the dialogue between the characters to establish what their relationships are, on what state the world is in, as well as setting off a mystery that would push the story forward. With the Charlton Comics Peacemaker stand-in character, the comedian, being murdered as the inciting incident, the Question stand-in character Rorschach investigating it and sharing his investigations to the other stand-in characters. With Ted Kord's Blue Beetle being represented by Daniel Dreiberg, aka the former Nite-Owl 2, which makes Hollis Mason's original Nite-Owl a stand-in for Dan Garrett's Blue Beetle. Adrian Wade, aka the former Ozymandias, stands for a character called Thunderbolt, while Dr. Manhattan stands in for Captain Atom, and the former Silk Spectre 2, aka Lori Juspesic, is a stand-in for Nightshade, although as a legacy character who took up the mantle from her mother, which would make her also be inspired by Black Canary, who is not an original Charlton Comics character. Anyway, those characters are also portrayed with organic kind of world building to show that they were not just created for when the story started, but have existed in their own world and have had a life in it. And that life has begun to not feel like living anymore for some of them. Even Dr. Manhattan's existence as the only superpowered being is treated initially as not a big deal, while his apathetic personality foreshadows that it is a downside to all the power he has. There is more to talk about when going over the rest of the issues, so looking back at how Watchmen was being done piece by piece helps me appreciate what Moore, Gibbons and Higgins were doing, as well as feel kind of bad for how DC Comics has taken Moore's original creations away from him, by promising to give them back to him once the book runs out of print, and then kept on printing copies of it to this day. With that said, and moving on to the adaptations made on the Watchmen comic, Alan Moore is naturally against them, and actually said back in 2008 that
There are things that we did with Watchmen that could only work in a comic, and were indeed designed to show off things that other media can't.
Well, while doing this 12-video series in comparing both adaptations to the comic, let's keep those words in mind so that we can pinpoint what those things are when we are going over the two adaptations. AKA, the 2009 movie directed by Zack, you either love him or hate him, Snyder, with the screenplay written by David Solid Snake Hayter, and the 2004 animated two-parter, which is directed by Brandon, also directed these movies and shows Vietti, from a screenplay written by J. Michael, they forced me into writing one more day, Straczynski. Actually, before we start, Alan Moore has also said that Hayter's screenplay was
as close as I could imagine anyone getting to Watchmen,
suggesting that he has read it, probably before it was chosen to be adapted, and that then maybe caused it to be chosen as the movie script. But Moore still refuses to watch the movie made out of it. And with that out of the way, now let's see how well the events of the first issue were adapted, starting with the 2009 movie.
Those were great times, huh, Rorschach? What happened?
You quit.
Unlike the comic it's based on, Snyder's and Hayter's movie starts with a cold opening doing some additional world building, before we are shown how Edward Blake, played by Jeffrey D. Morgan, is attacked in his apartment and eventually dies by being overpowered. That is then followed up by what is agreed to be the greatest movie opening montages of more world building, before the movie then catches up to where the comic starts from. Differences here are that the two cops do not talk about what we already saw, nor are they as opposed to the masked vigilantes, before Rorschach, played by Jackie Earle Haley, is shown almost immediately arriving to the abandoned crime scene to examine it. He finds Blake's comedian costume and weapons faster and easier than in the comic, and then has to leave while the officers looking after the scene almost catch him leaving. This is a new scene added to the movie, and is only present in the 3.5 hours long version, which I am using for this video by the way, rather than the 2-hour and 42-minute long theater version. When it comes to the next scene with Hollis Mason and Daniel Dreiberg, played by Stephen McHattie and Patrick Wilson, their conversation is written to have more necessary world building in how the original masked vigilante started out as the Minutemen. It is framed as the older man telling the same old stories to his younger successor, but otherwise we can all tell its exposition. As Daniel is then leaving, he and Hollis hear about Rorschach having attacked those police officers at Blake's apartment. Going from there, the movie goes pretty much like it did in the comic at Daniel's home, where Rorschach has broken in so they can talk about Blake's murder. Noticeable differences are how Rorschach does not suspect Blake's former colleagues like Hollis to have killed him, as well as saying that they should seek for retribution in seeing an attack on one of them as an attack on all of them. Daniel responds to that like this.
Watchmen are over.
Which would indicate that Snyder and Hayter chose to make the next generation of masked vigilantes team called Watchmen in the story. They did not have an official in-universe name in the comic, and the closest we got to one is only spoken in the next issue. The following changes made from the comic include cutting out Happy Harry's bar and grill scene, with Daniel instead going to see Adrian Wade, played by Matthew Good when he is in the middle of being interviewed. During this interview, Adrian also talks with the same responses that his comic book counterpart did with Rorschach, including calling himself what Rorschach did in insulting him.
Do you think the other Watchmen resent me for prostituting their struggle? It's a fair question. Yes. It's crossed my mind. Some of my old colleagues see it that way.
And after the interview, Adrian greets Daniel like an old friend he has not seen for a long time. Daniel and Adrian talk about what he and Rorschach talked about in this scene in the comic, with neither of them glorifying comedians' patriotic duties, but acknowledging the possibility of a mass killer running around. They also talk about a running theme that the movie had, and of which I want to talk about as a whole in a later video. Next, when Rorschach goes to see Dr. Manhattan and Laurie, played by Billy Crudup and Malin Ackerman, the refreshed dialogue has Rorschach call Laurie by her former vigilante name.
Nice to see you too, Silk Spectre.
I have a real name I've been using a couple years now, try it.
And Dr. Manhattan's powers are limited by Rorschach having also come to ask him to look into the future to see if Edward Blake's murderer is ever identified. This is how Dr. Manhattan explains why he can't do that.
My future is blocked by some kind of temporal interference. I cannot see it clearly. Tachyons, particles which travel backward through what you, therefore obscuring my vision of the present.
And after that, Dr. Manhattan sends Rorschach outside into the rain, before he and Laurie can start fighting over about what the comedian did or didn't do to her mother. That implication is instead acknowledged by having Dr. Manhattan try to help Laurie see a repressed memory foreshadowing a revelation about it as an example to her how Dr. Manhattan sees everything happening all at once. And then he tells Laurie that she is supposed to go on a dinner date with Daniel in the next scene, rather than having her organically get the idea from how Rorschach mentioned Daniel and Adrian earlier. Moving on to that restaurant scene, Raphael's is changed from a penthouse restaurant into a street-level restaurant, which I think Snyder used to film his creator cameo in his cut of the Justice League movie. There the dialogue between Daniel and Laurie almost immediately goes over talking about Captain Carnage, by using it as a segue into talking about why they used to go out and dress up as vigilantes like in the comic, and with Daniel also trying to give Laurie some support in her relationship with Dr. Manhattan.
Keeps getting further away from me. I can't even tell if he actually cares about me anymore, if he's just pretending.
If he's pretending, it means he cares.
The scene continues with Daniel helping Laurie to her car in the rain and having some final words when noticing her government escort.
You always get a government escort to dinner?
They're making sure I don't do anything to upset the country's most powerful weapon.
Before being driven off, Laurie apologizes to Daniel about not having been able to invite him on a proper good time and laughs, which Daniel understands by responding with the
What do you expect? The comedian's dead.
line from the comic. Okay, and that is how the 2009 movie covered the events of the first issue. Next, let's move on to how the 2024 animated movie did the same.
Those were great times, Rorschach. Whatever happened to them?
You're quit.
So, in contrast to Snyder's and Hayter's movie, Vietti and Straczynski's version is more visually faithful to its source material, and the dialogue is almost one-to-one to the point, where I had to pick up my copy of the book to follow how much it was lifted from there. That way, the real contrast is more in the performances of the voice actors and how they are directed to deliver their lines. So far, Titus Welliver plays Rorschach as the jerk he was in the comic towards Laurie when talking about her mother.
I'm not here to speculate on the moral lapses of men who died in their country's service.
While being more direct and less friendly, but trying with Daniel.
Right down this way. You haven't been down here in a while.
Neither of you. Lots of dust.
And with the Happy Harry's bar and grill scene kept in this version, it is easier to see how Rorschach has a reputation at being an unstable lunatic.
I've just broken this gentleman's little finger. Who killed Edward Blake?
It could also be the editing making his responses to Daniel in their conversation being more direct with haste than in the 2009 movie, which could have been a runtime issue. Matthew Russ's performance as Daniel is somewhat similar to Patrick Wilson, although he seems to have been animated to be more upbeat and friendly with Rorschach when acknowledging their working history together. Unlike how Wilson's Daniel seemed cautious and mostly tolerating Rorschach's presence while also taking his warnings of a mass killer seriously. The animation budget in Daniel's case also seems to be limited with how many character models he can have, as he is shown wearing the same clothes to his dinner date with Lori at Raphael's that he wore the previous night when having beers with Hollis. Kathy Sackhoff voicing Lori is able to match up with the bitter first impressions we saw in her first scene.
Besides, Blake was a monster. You know he tried to rape my mother when they were both Minutemen. Moral lapses! He broke her ribs,
And works otherwise well so far, while Michael Cerveris as Dr. Manhattan is...
A live body and a dead body contain the same number of particles. Structurally, there's no discernible difference. Life and death are unquantifiable abstracts. Why should I be concerned?
Well, more serene and detached from humanity, compared to Billy Crudup's regular voice making him sound like an ordinary man carrying all that power he has. Troy Baker voices Adrian in the one scene he has in the first issue, but so far it's just Troy Baker without standing out any different from Matthew Good's Adrian. Then there is the contrast between Jeffrey Dean Morgan and Rick D. Wasserman as Edward Blake aka the comedian, which is however going to have to wait until the next video, because this animated movie moved 3 out of the 5 flashback sequences from issue 2 to happen between the events of issue 1. And that is how the 2024 animated movie adapted the events from the first issue of Watchmen. So far, if I had to compare the 2009 and 2024 versions together, I would say that the former is trying to stand on its own to justify its existence with some differences, while the latter is so much similar to its source material that... no, it's too early to pass any judgments like that at this point. I need to go forward with the rest of the comic and the 2 adaptations to have more to say about them. So now is the right time to end the video and remind everyone on how YouTube works. Like this video, comment what thoughts and views you have on Watchmen as a comic with its adaptation when it comes to the events of the first issue, share this video for more people to see, and subscribe to be alert for the rest of this 12 videos long series. Also ding the bell to be alerted for the 3 times a week I will be streaming video games for a chance to chat with me, and may your heart be your guiding key.